Hi, I'm David Knabb, and this is Music 849, History of Classical Music. Today I want to talk through the two handouts posted on today's announcement. The first one called the Classical Era Overview, and after we go through that outline, I would like to talk through the other one, Sonata Allegro form and its antecedents. The Classical Era Overview takes a slightly different perspective than the John Rice book does, as far as big picture on the classical era. I often say that I'm interested in thinking about the bigger ideas of various historical eras. Most of you were in, I think everyone was in last semester's history of Baroque music, and we tried to do the same thing. We tried to think about the big ideas, and then to put various incidents, various figures, and especially various pieces of music into that context and to see how they fit in. There are many ways to organize historical study, and there are many ways to categorize these historical eras. What we traditionally in music have called the classical era has gone by many different titles. Sometimes it's called the Age of Reason. Some historians call it the Age of Enlightenment. Other historians, John Rice, for example, seems to have an affinity for the encyclopedic century. Depending on what we want to emphasize, sometimes different words, the words we pick to associate with a historical era have connotations. And we're going to stick with the term classical because it's been used probably for at least the last 100 years. I don't know the history of the use of the term, but it seems to have been used regularly for at least 80 years, probably much longer. So when we use the term classical, it has its problems, right? We term all Western art music classical. If you talk to your aunt or your uncle or a colleague at school and they say, I'm a classical music buff, I really love the music of Bach, of J.S. Bach. I just adore it. I just love I love all classical music. You as a musician know that Bach was not from the classical era, and you as a musician understand that when they say classical, I love classical music, they're talking about all Western art music. They're not talking about classical music in India, for example. India has its own classical music tradition, much separate from ours, as many countries do. So classical for us means the music of basically Haydn, Mozart, and early Beethoven, and their contemporaries, for the most part. The word classical for us, connotations. Classical is a reference to Greek-Roman classicism, and the values that we trace back to the thinkers and philosophers of that era. Values such as the importance of logic and reason. Aristotle was a classical thinker. Aristotle was a Greek. I'm not sure, I don't remember his dates exactly, somewhere between 600 and 400 BC, so very long time ago. We term that classical thought. Aristotle came up with, he codified various logical processes, including dialectic, including using syllogisms to come up, to induce or deduce reasoning. He came up with systems for coming up with reasonable conclusions. Classical refers to thought that is reasoned and logical. It refers to thought that values of proportion, symmetry, good taste, and especially proportion, symmetry, rationalism, not too much in one area without bringing up the other, nothing lopsided, not too much of anything on one way or the other, not too ornate, interest in the big picture, and comprehensibility. These are all classical era traits. General philosophical trends in the area include A. Mankind is basically good. Most human beings are good inside. All human beings are good inside. And there is evil in the world, but it is a corruption of that goodness. It doesn't exist inherently of its own. So mankind is basically good. Secondly, education was stressed as having the ability to enable individuals to achieve their potential. And many of our educationists began thinking and writing and discussing ideas of education as we see things today. The idea that education is something everyone should have the benefit of, and education enables us to achieve our potential and our best efforts in adult life. Thirdly, that human beings possess dignity. Human beings deserve dignity because we're human beings, not as a result of having a lot of money or having social prestige or being particularly good looking or bad looking. Human beings deserve and possess dignity in their own right. And these are some enduring truths of classical era thought of this era between about 1750 and 1820, when this music was being composed that we're going to be talking about this semester. Secondly, the idea of empiricism was being developed in a way that increasingly looked like the way we look at empiricism today. Empiricism basically is the idea that all human knowledge must be derived from observation, and not just accepted from superstition or dogma. Not just because an authority tells you something is true. That can add credibility, but the proof is in the pudding, and direct observation is the key to understanding the universe. And this leads directly into scientific method, right? In science, everything must be measured. Everything must be articulated and annotated with numbers. You measure the compounds before you heat them up together, and then you measure the weight after they've been heated at a certain temperature, and then you do whatever computations you need for the stoichiometry if you're familiar with chemistry, and that's how we understand how chemical processes work. Or in the field of astronomy. Recently we just got some information from a spacecraft that went past Pluto and now has gone past this other object in the Kuiper Belt, and it's the direct observations of the spacecraft that are allowing us to better understand the development of the solar system. I'm sorry, not Kuiper Belt. I think it's Kuiper Belt is the way people are discussing it. I'm sure you're probably familiar with this if you've looked at the news in the last few weeks. you get the idea. So empiricism, the belief in observation as the basis for human understanding of the universe, was on the rise. Secondly, there was a new skepticism of religious authority during the age, which goes along with A, right? Knowledge based from observation, not dogma or superstition. Increasing numbers of people were seeing religious authority as dogma, and as religious authority rejecting truths based on observations. For example, think of Galileo, who observed the motions of the planets and the motions of the moons around the planets with his telescope. Galileo Galilei, you're probably familiar with this story. And based on those observations, he used mathematics and logical reasoning to conclude that the sun was the center of our solar system, as opposed to the religious dogmatics who the Catholic Church at the time believed vehemently that the earth was the center of the entire universe. And you see, these things were at conflict. And so the people interested in science and empiricism increasingly came to loggerheads against the religious establishment. And we continue to fight these battles today, don't we? If you look at the news, there are many arguments today about some topics that such as evolution and Darwin's theory of natural selection and so forth. This is all part of the same line of thought that began to really take increasing hold during this era. And that goes along with C. There was a growth in confidence of people, the growth in the confidence people had in science and the scientific method. So more and more people were seeing the value and the benefits of this empiricism. New machines were being developed. You could better predict things like the weather if you had a barometer, or if you had an understanding of air pressure and air currents and so forth. It made the universe more understandable in some ways. And so there was a growth people had in confidence. There was a growth in the confidence that people had in science and the scientific method. We think that this conflict is big today, and many people think that atheism is more powerful today than it ever was. But from what I've read, during this period, it was even more. It was even more of a hot topic and more widely disputed than today. There were bloody fights and battles and wars fought over these conflicting ideals in various ways, depending on how you look at it. Roman numeral 3, there was a growth in the ideals of the rights of man as expressed originally by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He wrote about the value of the human being, the dignity of a person, that human beings are basically equal to each other, and we need to respect each other and preserve those rights. Those are the same sentiments that later were studied and echoed by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence and in the U.S. Constitution, the basic idea that all men are created equal, supposedly. And these were ideals that were originally articulated at this time. Secondly, the tolerance of individual differences, tolerating people of various religious sentiments. And before this, there were many There were even at this time religious wars and religious conflict and conflict between people of different languages, different parts of the world. There was at this time, there was a growing belief in tolerance of difference. See, brotherly love, the acceptance of differences, and a increasingly seeing the value of tolerating other people who are different than yourself. D. Fraternal intellectual societies such as the Freemasons were on the rise in the classical era. The Freemasons basically was a secret society. I don't know much about it. I've only read what I've seen in general textbooks. A mysterious organization because a membership has never been publicized, and the rights of entry have never been publicized. Nobody knows what it takes to get in. There isn't an application one fills out on paper that I understand. At least during this time, the classical era, it was by invitation only. So you had to know someone who was in the Freemasons, who recommended you and vouched for you, and then you could be invited to join. And I don't know how it worked, but there must have been some rights and so forth to bring you into the organization. And then it was a society not to put other people down, but to try and build up communities through intellectual discussion, pursuit, study, sharing ideas, developing ideas, and so forth. Some famous Freemasons, we don't really know who was a Freemason because its membership is secret, and I don't know anything about this, but apparently there is evidence that Thomas Jefferson, George Washington were Freemasons. I don't know, but these things are possible. We believe that Mozart was a member of the Freemasons, and Mozart's clarinet player, whose name is escaping me at the moment. Mozart had a good friend who played clarinet, and Mozart wrote the concerto for this man and some clarinet chamber music, and they were good friends, and they were apparently both Freemasons. His clarinet player's name will come to me in a moment. I didn't write it down, and I'm not very sharp at the moment. Moving on to music. Well-known expressions of classical ideals. Expressions being works of art, works of intellectual activity that were created in the classical era that we are familiar with. Whether or not you recognize them as articulations of classical thought is up to you, but nevertheless, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, we've mentioned, the idea that all men are created equal, which is in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, the United States Declaration of Independence states that when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one nation of people to separate itself from another, basically we must articulate the reasons for our desiring to separate ourselves from England. This wasn't an impassioned act like we hate England. This was a rational. These were rational. It was a logical presentation of the facts that led our founding fathers to separate ourselves from our motherland, England, in the Declaration of Independence, especially the U.S. Constitution. If you think about the Constitution, is also very rational, and there's an emphasis in the balance of powers. We talk about that all the time in government class, in history class, in contemporary discussions on television of what's happening in our political world today. We don't. People are afraid that one branch of government oversteps is overstepping its authority from another. These are classical ideas that everything must be balanced. If we're going to set up the ideal government, that we need a balance of powers so that no individual or small group of individuals have too much influence. And the Founding Fathers recognized that our country would take this balance of power and we would lose some advantages of a dictatorship or a monarchy. Progress would happen more slowly because it takes more time to get a large group of people behind an idea and come up with democratically created bills and laws. So we lost a great deal of efficiency. We all know it's famous that our government is famously inefficient. And that is partially by design. Now, if it's more inefficient now than when the Founding Fathers imagined it and wrote the Constitution, I'm not here to tell you that. But that was part of the design of the Constitution. Rational organization, everything has to follow. There are processes and procedures to guide human events, and when those processes and procedures are published and widely known, it's to everyone's benefit. And we can follow them. And also the Constitution with the preservation of rights of the individual, especially in the Bill of Rights, articulating the right to vote, and the right, for example, the right to vote is not dependent on ownership of property or the color of our skin or our inherited wealth or status or religious background. So the U.S. Constitution is a prime example of classical ideals and values. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Rights of Man, if you have a chance to read that, or you Google it and you find it, it's an essay of just a few pages, which predate Thomas Jefferson's writing. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a French man writing about these philosophies of human brotherhood and the rights of the individual in France, which had a powerful influence on the American Founding Fathers, as well as, which of course led to the American Revolution, as well as in France itself, which eventually, within a few years, was going to undergo its own revolution and overthrow of the monarchy, which took considerable time, blood, sweat, and treasure, and was a very messy situation for a long time. So Rousseau was an influential thinker during the time. Thomas Jefferson's Monticello house on the back of the U.S. 5-cent piece. If you take out a nickel, which I don't have in my pocket, but on the back side is a picture of the Monticello house, which is still in Virginia. I think it's in Virginia. The design, Jefferson himself designed Monticello, and he employed classical ideas in its design. If you look at that building on the back of the nickel, it has a triangular frontispiece, which is capped with a dome. It's balanced left to right, and then underneath that are some columns, classical-looking columns, and then a wing on each end. It's completely symmetrical left to right. It's balanced, proportioned, and this was seen as beautiful and elegant during the time. Now, these were the classical ideals. Human beings did not we do not always live up to our ideals. And we do know, it's a fact, that Jefferson, Washington, and many other people during this time were slave owners and violating these very principles which they so elegantly wrote out. And John Rice in our textbook calls that the fishtail, the ugly part of the classical era. While all these beautiful, elegant thoughts were available to the wealthy and the rich and the influential, common people often did not reap the same benefits. And intellectual thought and art and music were accessible basically to a privileged few rather than to the masses. It was much more exclusive than it is today, and we will experience that through the semester. Musical artistic movements included in the classical era include Galant style, Empfindsamer which is hard to say, Empfindsamer Empfindsamer. It's a German word which means sensitive style, which, along with Galant style, were articulations of elegance and simplicity that led us out of Baroque music, which preceded the classical era, into early classical music, which began to emphasize these ideals of balance, proportion, elegance, grace, simplicity, ease of understanding, intellectual accessibility, so that you didn't need special training to understand the elegance of a Mozart piano sonata. It just made sense to you on the first time you heard it. It was not complicated like Johann Sebastian Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, which has such intricate, complex harmonic progressions and so forth. So Empfindsamer Stil, Galant style were lead-ins into the classical era. On the back end of the classical era, we get a movement called Sturm und Drang. Storm and stress is the literal translation from the German, which means increasing interest in extremes, storm and stress as being constructive elements, and as far as finding the limits of human understanding. And music became much more moody, and drama became increasingly important in music of the late classic era, as we get into Beethoven, for example. When we really get into romantic music, Sturm und Drang is kind of a transition influence at the end of classical music into what's going to become romantic music. And finally, at the bottom of the page, we get to what Dr. Nabb considers the most important musical development of the classical era, sonata allegro form. Now, sonata allegro form is another problematic term. This is the term historians came up with, or musicians came up with long ago, and it has connotations that are confusing to us. Sonata allegro form is sometimes called sonata allegro form, sometimes it's called sonata form. Sonata form and the sonata as a genre, we talked a lot in Baroque music about the sonata as a genre. The sonata being could be virtually any music for instruments, increasingly became a chamber music work, or a work for an individual instrument, and the parameters were still wide open. So the sonata as a genre is different than sonata form. So you have to be, we must be careful and consistent when we use the term Mozart Piano Sonata or Haydn Piano Sonata or this sonata opus whatever, and sonata form. So the form refers to the structure of an individual movement. It does not, form does not refer to the structure of a multi-movement work. Sonata Allegro form refers to the structure of an individual movement. And we're going to talk considerably about Sonata Allegro form. It is the most important development of the classical era because it became a very effective architectural principle for creating large-scale works for instruments. Before Sonata Allegro form, a movement for instruments might last 3 or 4, maybe 5 minutes at the most. With the development of Sonata Allegro form and its sophisticated ancestors and its sophisticated followers, we get instrumental movements that can last not 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, but easily 15 or 20 minutes, or a movement later in the Romantic era, we get movements that last 45, 50 minutes for a single movement, which is extraordinary compared to where instrumental music was before. So, Sonata Allegro form allowed us to create, or allowed our predecessors to create, instrumental music that began to rival the importance of the significance and the scope of music for voice. Before this, as we know, opera was dominant. Even in the classical era, opera was still basically number one as far as the most influential musical genre. But instrumental music increasingly becomes more important, increasingly becomes more sophisticated, and it begins to rival opera. Later in the Romantic era, instrumental music overtakes vocal music for a time in its sophistication and relative importance. Vocal music always has the advantage of being held together by text, by words, by poetry. As you know, most opera starts with a libretto or a text, a biblical text, a poem by a poem specialist who writes the text or the lyrics, and then a composer would set that to music. And the words and the meaning of the words hold together the piece. But with instrumental music, we don't have words. So for a piece to make sense from beginning to end and have logical organization that we all hear and understand in some sense, Sonata Allegro form gave us that, allowed people to do that. So I want to introduce Sonata Allegro form at the beginning of this semester because we're going to see it gradually develop through the semester, and it bears some beautiful fruit near the end. So for that reason, you have a second handout, Sonata Allegro form and its antecedents, which is basically a repackaging of information given in Chapter 2 of the John Rice textbook. Sonata Allegro form was the product of a very clear evolution of an old form, originally called binary, a two-part form that was used in 80 to 90% of Baroque instrumental music. Binary form is a simple form with two sections, each repeated. In my diagram, we just call them A repeated and then B repeated. And the key areas, it always starts in the tonic, the major one if it's a major piece, and then it goes to the dominant at the repeat sign at the end of the first section, and beginning of the second section is in dominant, the B section, and then it comes back home to the tonic at the end. And this structure of two repeated sections moving from 1 to 5 to 1 is today widely known as binary form. And there is a very nice little tiny example that's easy to understand of binary form in your John Rice textbook on page 21, which you may pull out your textbook at this point and refer to that. This little piece by François Couperin, La Grâce Naturelle, from the second book of Pièces de Clavecin from 1716. This is a little tiny, tiny movement that's just, I don't even, if you count the measures, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 measures long, and it's an entire movement. And it's a clear binary form, two repeated sections, 1, 5, 1 basically, in the key of C major. It couldn't be more simple. Now this is a nice example because it's so small it fits right on half a page of your textbook and is easy for John Rice to include in the text. It's shorter than most examples of binary form, but it does get the message across. It's easy to understand. It's simple enough to where each of us should be able to play through it. I would encourage you to do that if you haven't done so already. From binary form, we started to see a more sophisticated approach in rounded binary, which introduced a principle of symmetry by, instead of just going A, B, A, B, A repeated, B repeated, it goes A repeated, B, and then coming back to A at the end. So it looks like it's symmetrical, right? The beginning is similar to the end, but it retained the repeats. So it's two large repeated sections, A, a B section, and a return to the A. They still rounded binary still basically went 1, 5, 1. And rounded binary was basically a transition form between binary and sonata allegro form. An example of rounded binary form, see the Anna Bonn in our score anthology on page 84. That's a little keyboard piece which is rounded binary, and you can hear the return of the A section not long before the very end. And we begin to hear thousands of pieces organized like this, and the return to the beginning sound begins to connote to the listener. We begin to hear, oh, it sounds like it's getting ready to end. The beginning is coming back. That's familiar. We're back home. And then chung, chung, chung. And then you're at the end. Sonata allegro form is what I've been trying to get to, was more sophisticated than rounded binary. But this is what we're getting to. You can see how closely it resembles rounded binary. The biggest difference between rounded binary and sonata allegro form is that the A section in sonata allegro form has a principal theme and a secondary theme. The principal theme, you're going to see increasingly that instrumental music is organized by key area, and key area defines structure. It's an architectural, well, it's how the pieces are held together, and it gives where the piece moves as far as key areas, helps us, our ears, understand when we're moving away, when we've got new ideas happening, and when we're returning home. So in the exposition, which is what the first A section begins to be called, there's a principal theme which is in the home key, often called the P theme, P for principal, and it contrasts with the secondary theme, which is in a different key area, often the 5, or if the principal theme is in minor, it can be in the major 3, which is the relative major. So it's in a closely related key, principal theme, secondary theme, and that's the exposition, and it was often repeated. Not necessarily repeated. Later, the repeats begin to disappear. And then the big second section, which was just a B, A, and rounded binary, becomes the B section increasingly is called the development section, and the return of the A is called the recapitulation increasingly, because it's the return, it's the recap, or some people you can just call it the return because it sounds like the beginning, and we get back to our home key. The development section is increasingly modulatory. Traditionally it was in the dominant, but it could go through 5 or 6 key areas within the development section, depending on how creative and artistic your composer was and what was trying to be achieved. The recapitulation comes home clearly to the principal theme in the tonic, and the secondary theme comes back as well, but this time no longer in a closely related key. This time in the recapitulation, the secondary theme is stated in the tonic key area, which is different than it was in the exposition. In the exposition, it was in a closely related key, so everything stays home in the home key in the recap. And then the big second section, the BA, the part that was BA in rounded binary, sometimes has a repeat sign, very rarely. In a few instances, the second large section can be repeated. For example, in our textbook uses the Johann Christian Bach in the score anthology on page 37. You should go through that and identify the sections. And the second large section does have a repeat sign. It's one of a very few sonata allegro movements where the second section is repeated that I'm aware of. I hope this, I'm sorry I'm tired tonight, and there are moments when I lacked clarity in our little discussion. So if you have questions, please post them on the website. I'm glad to see you all in class this semester, and we'll be in touch.